Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Blink of an Eye, which is episode 12 of season 6 of Star Trek Voyager. This video is part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek as determined by my user polls. The episode to win my user poll focused on Star Trek Voyager is the episode Blink of an Eye. So Blink of an Eye is an episode where Voyager gets trapped in an orbit of a strange planet which orbits extremely fast, where there's a time difference between Voyager and the planet, where the planet goes, time goes by very quickly, so centuries pass, while Voyager tries to get unstuck. And in the meantime, the civilization below develops a mythology of Voyager, and eventually an astronaut comes on board Voyager and helps Voyager escape. So this is a fan favorite. This is, I believe, the highest, or at least tied for the highest rated episode on IMDb. I personally love this episode. I had a friend who this was their favorite episode. So, yeah. I think very highly of this episode. Now, watching it again, I don't think I'd say it's my favorite Voyager episode. I can't remember what I ranked it when I did my rankings. I believe it made my top 10, if not at least my top 20, definitely. Because, I don't know, it's not really a heartfelt, like, emotional thrill ride, or really emotional, impactful. Like, there's a lot of great Voyager episodes that are like that particular Year of Hell, or a few others. Memorial this season was also pretty powerful. Well, this one is a more sort of contemplative episode. It's a really interesting sci-fi scenario. And this is something, Star Trek has a lot of these, particularly Next Generation and Voyager, will have a lot of these standalone episodes where something weird happens. And I think this is one of the better, more unique ones. I think it seems very unique in terms of a Star Trek episode, because so much of it takes place on the planet below. And pretty much every time we visit the planet, it's an entirely different group of characters, entirely different group of actors, which is, I do think, is really risky. And I do think that is unique for Star Trek and something that's not done. But it's more of painting an overall picture of the society and how it's affected, how Voyager has affected them. So that's the theme, even though Voyager and the crew of Voyager isn't seen, like, you know, as seen a bit less in this episode than others, it's still the theme is Voyager. It's all about Voyager and the impact that it had on the planet. And of course, it's a very fascinating concept that time is moving by so fast, and the impact it has. Like, you have Chakotay trying to study it because he, you know, is a bit of an anthropologist. And I believe someone complained when this episode first came out, since when is Chakotay in anthropology? It's mentioned several times in Voyager, I'm sure, before this. I pretty much remember that in my last rewatch. But anyway, but there's a lot of, you know, talk about, arguments about the Prime Directive, and particularly when one of the scientists reached out, sends a radio transmission to Voyager, and Tom Paris listens to it and says, like, because the guy did want to know, like, people on the planet, because Voyager's presence is causing all these earthquakes, so they call it the ground shaker, and the guy just sends a very candid radio signal saying, look, if you're shaking our ground, please stop. You're causing a lot of damage. And Tom's like, I want to answer these people, but, you know, Tuvok and Mr. Killjoy is just like, oh, the Prime Directive applies because they're still pre-warp. But Tom makes a good argument that we already made first contact. It's already made. They're already well aware of us. You know, and someone else points out, you know, Tom says, oh, that guy deserves an answer, but someone else points out, well, that guy's been dead because of the time difference. He's like, fine, I'll give the answer to his son or his grandson. I don't care. So it's a very interesting concept, and I like the portrayal of the planet itself. I think it's very clever how they have little intricacies about how, Voyager would affect, and that they are aware that Voyager is a foreign object. It's not something that's natural to the planet, because in ancient times, of course, it came their lore because it was written when the tribal people saw it first appear, and that's when it corresponded to the ground shaking. And then I'm sure in later years, once this civilization was more advanced, they had scientific technology, they could measure that Voyager was a foreign object in orbit that was directly responsible for the ground shaking. So that made things interesting, and I do love how when they showed that first scene with the primitive tribal culture, and they show they're doing this ritual where they're offering up fire fruit or whatever, which I can't remember what it's called, but I used to get the prop that they use in that episode. It's like a tamarillo or something. It's kind of like a passion fruit. I used to have in New Zealand a lot. But anyway, they call it fire fruit. So they're offering it up to their god, but then that star appeared, which was Voyager, and the ground started shaking. And they were like, oh, well, fuck that. The god doesn't want the fire fruit. Then the fire fruit aren't for people anymore. They're just for... They represent the ground shaker, the sky ship, or Voyager, which is interesting. It's interesting how that stayed in their mythology, because they time jumped to a couple hundred years later, where they were still joking about civilization had become more advanced. It was looked more like a Renaissance era-esque time period. And yet they still had that superstition of not eating fire fruit. In fact, one of the guys sort of mocked another guy, saying, "Oh, if you just think it's all superstition, why don't you just have a fire fruit?" And he was like, "Oh, I'm not having a fire fruit." And he was like, "Well, see, some things are there important, but there's probably nothing wrong with this fire fruit. It's just something. It's a I don't want to say superstition, more of a belief that was ingrained in their culture due to and that's really fascinating. The way this episode explored this, and of course, the episode changes direction a little bit. It gets more into overdrive and focuses more on the Voyager crew when the civilization starts developing even more, getting a lot more advanced, becoming more like our modern times, and even surpassing our modern times. And that's when the Voyager crew begins interacting with them a lot more, which is really interesting. So the first one I want to talk about is when the Doctor beams down to the planet on the reconnaissance mission, because they want to send someone down on reconnaissance, but the Doctor points out that anyone would probably die because of the strain between the time difference, but the Doctor would be fine. So they send the Doctor, and they program him to take on the form of whatever people just happen to be living there, because they don't know, because there's... Although Chakotay can monitor everything closely, like he even says, "Oh, I can tell you where all the best places to eat," and yet they don't know what the people look like. But whatever. Anyway, he's able to pinpoint where all the opera houses are. But anyway, they send the Doctor down, and they were supposed to send him down just for 3 seconds, which would be a couple days or something. But then the transporter malfunctions, and fuck, we gotta fix the transporter, so it takes them 5 minutes instead, and so or something like that. And the Doctor's been there for 3 years, which is really fascinating, because it comes up, it's he hugs Janeway. I really like the way that scene played, because Janeway and B'Elanna's like, "We just saw you a couple minutes ago," but for him, it's been 3 years, so he's like, "I never think I'd see you again." He's so happy to see them. And then he talks about, he acquired an affinity for the people. He's aware of their culture, and says that he actually has a strong appreciation for them. He talks about a couple close calls, but saying that he really like appreciates these people. And you do think about it. 3 years for the Doctor is a long time, because this is the 6th season, so he's only been alive for 6 years. So that's the equivalent of half of the life he's lived so far. So it's like, at the moment, it's like a third, sorry, doing my math. A third of his life was spent on that planet, and the 2/3 on Voyager. So that's that's pretty damn interesting. So I do see why the Doctor would be behaving that way, and why he would feel like this is almost like it was his people. Like he adopted this culture, like he was a part of it. And I'm a bit disappointed because they do play this as a standalone episode. It's never referenced again. I am disappointed that they don't reference this for the Doctor's character, at least this aspect of it. And the most interesting part to me is because he talks about how he had a roommate, and it's obviously there were romantic implications there, because he talks about how he's lonely, he needed companionship, and Janeway's like, that, you don't need to explain, that's perfectly fine. But then when he's talking later to oh god, I gotta look up his name, but the astronaut dude who comes up later on, who's actually played by Jin from Lost, Daniel Day Kim, anyway, when he's talking to him, he asks the astronaut dude to, I'll see if I can look up his name. Gitana Retz. That's his name, Gitana Retz. So he asks Gitana Retz if he can look up his son. And he's like, what do you mean, son? I thought you were a hologram. And he's just like, oh, it's a long story. And he's like, I'm sure he's dead by now, but surely he might have children or grandchildren. You can tell them about me. And Gitana Retz is like, absolutely. So this is a very interesting concept to me. I'm a bit disappointed that the show kind of glossed over, because we never really did get an explanation of what he means by his son. I think the easiest explanation is that he somehow just adopted him or was looking after him. Maybe it was his lovers already had the son from a different marriage, or maybe they found an orphan and looked after him. I don't know. That's the easiest explanation, that he sort of raised him. I would assume that it was an infant, but it could have been. He could have been an older kid when the Doctor first started taking care of him. But that's really interesting. Although I will say, like, he was only there for 3 years, so that does seem like a short amount of time. But I mean, yeah, I don't know. He'd still get an affinity for sure, but he was kind of acting like he was looking after him for decades, when really it was just 3 years. It actually would have been more interesting if they left the Doctor there for decades, but yeah, 3 years is long enough. I wish that they would have done like a Voyager novel, because they have all these non-canon Star Trek novels. I wish they would have done a Voyager novel that was just about the Doctor's time that he spent on the planet in this episode. I think that would be an interesting novel. I think there would be a lot of interesting ground that they could cover, and that would explore the Doctor's character more. But whatever. But other than that, he starts talking sports with Gitana Retz and being like, oh, I remember this. He would go into exile rather than play the game and blah, blah, blah. Funny thing is, like, I kind of can relate with living in another culture and adopting that other culture's customs. I know it's to a much smaller degree, but when I lived in New Zealand for 15 years, and I never got into their sports. I never watched rugby, and I still barely know how it's played, even though I lived there for 15 years. The Doctor's only been playing for 3 years, and all of a sudden he's like an expert and totally engaged. But then again, I was never into sports in the first place. But then again, the Doctor was never shown to be into sports either. He's more of an opera man, so yeah, I think it's just kind of a cheap, lazy way to be, oh, look, he's really into this culture now because he's He likes the sports team, which I think is kind of dumb. And plus, like, Star Trek times have been shown to kind of be beyond sports anyway, but Voyager and Deep Space Nine roll this back a lot because they didn't really they want to make it more relatable to modern times. But anyway, I'm going off on a tangent. I did think that was a really interesting aspect. So now let me get more into Katana Reds. Because to me, this is where the episode gets really interesting. We have the two, because it was a nice build up to it though, because getting all the going from like cavemen basically to Renaissance time to like early 20th century time, and now we get like moving to more caught up to modern time, and you have astronauts going to Voyager, and seeing their awe and interaction with the crew. I mean, I often criticize Brennan Braga for wanting to integrate like early astronaut travel into Star Trek, where I don't think it fits. He wants to do like right stuff. He did a couple of Voyager episodes, and Enterprise, the whole first 2 seasons were a disaster because he kept wanting to push this. But this is a rare occasion where he did actually insert that, but I loved it. I think I actually like it in this context that it's not about human astronauts, but they related to this alien species and saying what they were like and all they have at discovering the sky ship. And I love the touch. Also, I forgot to mention about the touch about the sky ship fringe, which were like toys. Like there was a whole like mythology made up about them in this sort of more 20th century setting. It was more like a pop TV show or comic book or something, which is interesting to think about. And I imagine like they were absolutely nothing like Voyager. They're probably like gods and they're like wearing togas. Like, oh, that's what I would imagine these sky friends to be like. But anyway, so these astronauts go up and they actually go on Voyager and they find like the crew is stuck. It kind of reminded me of the original series episode Wink of an Eye, which is really interesting to get it from their perspective. Although some might say that the entire episode is kind of like Wink of an Eye because it's called Blink of an Eye, Wink of an Eye, get it? But I think the episodes are very, very different. Very different. I don't think this is at all copying it in any way. But that one scene, though, because the way in the original series episode Wink and Lie, they would show Kirk and other people who were, well, not Kirk, the other people like Spock and Chekhov and Scotty would be moving very slowly to the point where it looks like they're stuck. Although there's a lot of inconsistencies in that episode. This episode was a bit more consistent mainly because it was shorter. And, at first, like, what's going on? Maybe they're in stasis, but then they go to the bridge and they see Neelix pouring Janeway coffee and it's like stuck, and the coffee is stuck in midair, and they're like, this isn't stasis. I don't really get why they had time to wander around the whole ship before the time effect affected them. It seems like the time effect should have affected them immediately, but whatever. I don't. That doesn't really bother me. But one of the astronauts, of course, dies, but Gratana Ritz, Daniel Day Kim, survives, and he forms a friendship with Janeway and with the Voyager crew, and I absolutely buy that. I love his interactions because he even talks about, like, she apologizes and says, I'm so sorry, and I think you're stuck here with us now. And he's like, this is like a dream come true for him. Like, this is like a deepest mythology. This is like, I'm trying to think of a modern day example. It's like if someone found out that dragons were real. Or Merlin was real, or they found the lost city of Atlantis, or something everyone believes is a myth, and they actually are there and discover that it's true, and how just in awe he is of that. And also, he does talk about how, and they did in this brief amount of time touch on how he realizes, though, by staying up there, the longer he stays up there, the more changed, like, his world will be, and that pretty much everyone he knew will be dead by then. But he's still willing to do it because he wants to help out Voyager. But when the planet below starts sending up the ships that start attacking Voyager, he's like, all right, time for me to go back down because I need to stop this shit and save you guys. And that was amazing too. I absolutely love that scene where he's going down. And this is also a great example of how you can have this dynamic storytelling, exploring all these facets, but still doing it on a cheap budget. Because you know how they didn't actually show the capsule landing on the planet and him going to this huge governmental agency, because that would have cost a lot of money to do. Instead, they just have a nice, like, quiet scene with him on the capsule flying down, and he's trying to radio someone, and the person, of course, thinks he's lying, that he couldn't be who he says he is. And actually, they suggest that he's become somewhat of a figure, or a historical figure. I can't remember exactly how much time has passed, but enough time to pass where he would either be an old man or dead, so they don't believe he is who he says he is. And that was a great scene. I absolutely love that scene. I do kind of wish we could have gotten a follow-up and see him land, but I understand why they didn't do it. And I think the episode's good enough without it, just to be clear. And then, of course, I mean, I think, like, the thing with the ships attacking Voyager to the point where Voyager's almost destroyed, that is a tad bit of a, we gotta have a threat of the week, because this is something that bothered me about Voyager's 4th, 5th, and 6th season. I'm sorry, 5th, 6th, and 7th season. That's what I meant to say. Particularly the 6th and 7th. Is that every single episode had to have a threat of the week. Voyager, the crew, always had to be put in mortal danger every week. There's something in producers or studios, someone forcing the show, and I thought it was bullshit. That's why I kind of prefer the earlier seasons. But, like, this is an episode where I actually don't mind it, or at least not as much, but I can see that little finger on, oh, we gotta put Voyager in danger, so let's have the planet below send these ships to try to destroy Voyager. I mean, I buy it. I think it's good. I don't think it's 100% necessary. Whenever I watch it, I do think, yeah, this is them having to put Voyager in danger, but it doesn't hurt the episode. Let me put it that way. It doesn't interfere with how great this episode is. It's still good seeing Gutana Ritz show up, or Daniel Day Kim, and beam over, and their technology is now beyond what Voyager's. And that seemed to happen rather quickly, though. But anyway, he has the differential, the time differential. He can beam over and still remain on his own time and say goodbye to his friends in Voyager. And I absolutely fucking love the final scene of this episode. I thought it was, even though I said this isn't a really emotional episode or emotionally impactful, I do think that ending scene is. I think that is a very emotional, satisfying. I think that's a perfect way to end the episode, where they show Daniel Day Kim sitting, because before he left, like Janeway said, they had to get the engines ready because the ships got Voyager out of orbit, so not stuck there anymore. And Janeway said, well, it will take us 2 hours to get the warp drive going. So 2 hours is like several decades. So you see Daniel Day Kim as an old man watching Voyager finally leave, finally get their engines done, and how, like, that look of satisfaction on his face, like he's watching an old friend finally go home. Like, that's very touching. I thought that was a great way. And as I said, I think this was like a perfect, like, I don't even mind that they didn't spend much time on Daniel Day Kim's character, because I think the point wasn't his character specifically, but the entire plan. I think it's a lot more interesting to get that whole backstory, the whole build-up of the entire civilization, what impact Voyager had, and then getting this character and seeing that that's what really sold his awe and his appreciation and basically his love for Voyager, because it's living mythology for him, and that's just. It was very powerful. So I definitely see why a lot of people love this episode. I think it's a really great episode. I think I would be remiss, though, if I didn't talk about a lot of, apparently, YouTube critics in general, and maybe a few other people on the internet, have criticized this episode for borrowing too heavily, let's say, from an 80s classic sci-fi novel called Dragon's Egg. I personally have not read this novel, so I can't really speak to any specifics. But I did read a description of the novel, and I will make clear I can't make any definitive judgments because I haven't read the novel myself. But from reading that description, I do think I get the impression that the people they're claiming like this episode is basically plagiarism. That it's, in fact, I've heard people trash this episode because it is just ripping off this book. And based off the description I read from the book, I think that's a load of nonsense. And I've said this before in one of my videos, and someone like in the comments like linked me to this other video, and they're like, watch this other video and explain why it's ripping off Dragon's Egg. So I watched the video, and I still think they're wrong. Like, it didn't convince me. There was no hard evidence. To me, the case they presented, and the case I've seen everyone present, it's coming off as a Groundhog's Day situation. Because to me, the novel is none of the specifics are the same. It seems like the only thing that's the same is that there's a planet where it is moving very fast, and there's humans above watching it move very fast. Or even if maybe that's not even the case. I can't remember. But so to me, and none of the specifics. Maybe there were like specifics about the episode that I'm not getting because, as I said, I haven't read the book. But from what I heard, I hadn't. If that's the truth, some of these videos I watched would have pointed them out, and they didn't really. What they're pointing out to me just seemed like a generalized. Oh, they're doing a fast planet, therefore it's a ripoff. To me, this is a Groundhog's Day situation. What I mean by this is because Groundhog's Day, it's not even the first, it's the most popular and well-known time loop story. So it seems like whenever there's a time loop story, particularly if it's a comedy, it's ripping off Groundhog's Day. And that kind of irritates me. It's funny, the Next Generation episode, Cause and Effect, actually came out before Groundhog's Day. So you could say Groundhog's Day was ripping off Cause and Effect. But really, it's because it's so popular, well-known, and especially if there's a comedy, because Groundhog's Day is a comedy, they'll just say, oh, we're ripping off Groundhog's Day, which that annoys me. That bothers me, because it's not. Groundhog's Day does not have a monopoly on time loop stories. I'm sorry, it's a genre on its own a lot because it's just very similar, so a lot of stuff that do time loop stories will be similar because by nature it's a very similar concept, but it doesn't mean they're all ripping off Groundhog's Day. That's just a load of bullshit, and it annoys me when people say that. And I think it's the same situation here. This Dragon's Egg does not have a monopoly on fast-moving planets. If someone shows me a whole bunch of specifics, then maybe I'll change my mind. But from everything I read, videos I watched, it was just generalized. Oh, we see civilizations go fast. That's just a general concept, like a time loop. Doesn't mean everything that does that concept is ripping off that novel. I think that's dumb. I'm sorry, I do. Honestly, and I want to say this, I have to bring this up again. I think the Deep Space Nine episode Siege of AR-558 is much clearer case of ripping off Saving Private Ryan than this is of ripping off that book. Again, I haven't read the book, so I can't be 100% on this, but that's from what I see. And I've gotten into arguments up and down with people, and people are still in denial and say, oh, it has nothing to do with Saving Private Ryan. I'm sorry, I will say it a billion times. You have to watch the ending scene of Saving Private Ryan, not the whole movie, just the ending scene, and watch the Siege of AR-558. And there's so many similarities, it's ridiculous. There's way more similarities than there is with this episode in Dragon's Egg. But anyway, I'm sorry. This doesn't bother me at all. I don't think this episode is ripping it off. I don't think it's plagiarism. I think people who say this episode sucks because of that book are being ridiculous. That's just my opinion, though. It's just the way I look at it. Maybe if I actually read the freaking book, I might have a different opinion. But it is just how I see it. Anyway, my rating for Blink of an Eye out of 10 is a 10 the best. I think this is an amazing episode. I think is a shining example of Voyager, and it's a shining example of Star Trek in general, of having a unique concept, having a original episode, like a one-off weird sci-fi concept, and doing a really good job of it. See, that's why it doesn't bother me about this Dragon's Egg thing, because even if they really borrowed heavily from it, and some of my favorite episodes, by the way, they do borrow heavily from, like my favorite episode, Duet, from Deep Space Nine, borrows really heavily from a play about, in the 80s, I think, about, a Jewish person pretending to be a Nazi or something. But, so, even if they did borrow really heavily from this book, they did such a good job of it. They did such a good job, and I honestly think there's enough originality to it where I think it's ridiculous to call it plagiarism. But they did such a good job at this concept of really exploring this world, tying it into the characters. They had really fascinating character beats with, like, the Doctor and Janeway meeting Daniel Day Kim and seeing through his eyes, Voyager leaving. Like, it really is a wonderful episode, and I mean that as, like, it's really, it's wonder. It makes you wonder. Put it that way. It's full of wonder. It's full of awe, and that's something a lot of good Star Trek episodes don't have. Which I really like, and that to me overrides how it's maybe not as emotionally powerful as some other episodes. Anyway, that is it for my review of Blink and Lie. Thanks so much for watching. Be sure to check out my channel as I do many more Star Trek reviews, and I also cover other shows like The Expanse, Lost, Mr. Robot, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.